Okay, in this final video, I just want to talk about some of the symbolic representations that I see happening in the story. One of them, I'm going to keep pretty brief because I want to tackle it in the discussion questions and really let you guys kind of explore it. And I think it's a little bit more obvious. So in the story, we have the real life narrator, right? And she's imprisoned, not really imprisoned, but she's confined to this room. But it seems like she's in prison, right? And so what does she see in the wallpaper? Well, the wallpaper is disturbing, but the more the story goes on, she starts to see not just random images, but the image of a woman behind it. And that woman is sort of behind bars. So in a way, the real life narrator is confined in this room in the house, and then we have a woman who's confined behind bars in the wallpaper. And so, we can extrapolate that the narrator is sort of a foil for the woman who is in the wallpaper, and so the narrator is really trapped in the wallpaper and all sorts of things. And we can discuss that in the discussion thread later this week. But I also found another symbolic representation that I didn't catch on to when I was a student reading the story in the past. And maybe you guys will buy this and maybe you won't. And I started to notice it and I started to read and I was sort of looking with it and kind of doubting myself because I thought maybe this is kind of a weird idea. But I really think it's founded in the story. And that's where the wallpaper is sort of equated to writing paper, right? So let's think back, this is an online class, right? So you're seeing all of this digitally. I mean, you cannot see me giving you this lecture on paper. It doesn't exist that way, right? So our experience of the world is a little bit different than Charlotte Perkins Gilman's was. But in that time, there were no Kindles, there were no iPhones or iPads or anything like that. So the written word was written and you read it on paper, okay? And I think that there's this interesting play between the wallpaper and the actual paper that you read and that you write, okay? Because she's actually, she's writing in the story. So she is writing on paper. She is making marks on paper, just like there are marks on the wallpaper. And I think that there's an interesting, maybe not story, but there's an assessment or an opinion of writing given throughout the story. And so I've just got a few quotes here that I want to kind of discuss a little bit. And maybe you'll buy this and maybe you won't. And you can, by all means, blow me up if you feel like this is just total nonsense in the discussion thread. Because I'm interested, my students often will do that when I have something that they think is kind of unfounded or I'm getting into, English teacher mode and I'm reading too much into it. But I'll walk you through some of these quotes and you can decide whether you agree or disagree with me. So this is on 476. The wallpaper has a kind of sub-pattern in a different shade, a particularly irritating one, for you can only see it in certain lights and not clearly then. So if you look at the worksheets that I give you, we talk about plot, right? So I'm asking for plots, but I'm also asking for subplots. This wallpaper has patterns and it has sub-patterns. So maybe that's coincidence, but maybe it's not. A particularly irritating plot or subplot. You guys are probably really irritated with Hills Like White Elephants when if you couldn't quite figure out what the operation was, or you were trying to figure out why Hemingway just wouldn't come out and say it. A lot of people do get irritated when they look at literature and they see all of the stuff that's happening under the surface, and they wish that the author would just come out and say it already, right? If you're really thinking this thing, why don't you just make everyone's life easier and come out and say it? And you can only see it in certain lights and not clearly then. And I feel like that really represents at least my experience with literature. I mean, I just told you a few minutes ago that when I read this story now as an almost 30-year-old, it was much different than when I was reading it for the first time in high school or maybe in college when I was 18, 19, 20, 21. So different circumstances will change the way that I read or interpret a story. I gave you the things they carried. This is the first story of this semester. I teach that in my Comp 1 classes. And every time I read that to prep for class, I get something a little bit different out of it. And so while the narrator is in the room looking at the wallpaper, her experience of the wallpaper changes each time, just like I think that we all sort of read or interpret stories differently each time we come to them. And I don't know, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but I imagine that at some point during this semester you will read something that you have read in the past, right? It's an introduction to literature course, so some of these are sort of, these are canonized pieces of literature that you may have encountered elsewhere. But I imagine your experience of them might be different this time around than they were in previous times. And that's just the nature of art. It's something that we bring as the audience to it, and it's something that, like the narrator she has a different experience of the wallpaper each time that she looks at it. And so that's one sort of similarity that I see if we start to think of equating the wallpaper with art or with the art of writing in particular. So next quote, we're looking at 477. I know a little of the principle of design, and I know this thing was not arranged on any laws of radiation or alternation or repetition or symmetry or anything else that I have ever heard of. Sometimes when we read literature, we think it's pretty bizarre, right? And it's not constructed in a straightforward manner. And a lot of times art doesn't follow rules, right? If it's very formulaic, it usually doesn't equate to being good art. And so I think that her description of the layout of the designs here mimics or mirrors the way that art works, right? Because art does not necessarily come out of radiation, where all things come out of a central point with equal lengths, and where each line is separated. Because when we talk about radiation, I think it defines it in the text, yeah. A principle of design in which all elements are arranged in some circular pattern around a center. A lot of times there's not a real regular pattern that occurs in literature. There might be things that are similarities, but sometimes they're by chance. It's much less rigid than it is when you're talking about formulas. So there aren't laws of radiation or alternation or repetition or symmetry in stories. You might have foils, one character seems like another character, or you might have symbols where one thing is like another thing, but they're not a one-for-one equation. And so I think she's starting to interpret the wallpaper the way that she would interpret a piece of art, whether it's a piece of visual art or a piece of the written word, like a piece of literary art. Now on page 478. He says, no one but myself can help me out of it, meaning her funk, right, her depressive state. No one but myself can help me out of it. I must use my will and self-control. And I think that's really what the whole writing process is about. My experience as a student has been as a literature student, but also as a student of writing. And the more I familiarize myself with the writing process, you can have as many workshops as you want, and you can have 40 people in a classroom telling you what they think of your poem or short story, but really it's up to you. You've got to get the thing done. You have to sort through the 39 or 40 other opinions that you're getting and say, this is what really needs to work for the story. And so poems and stories are not built by workshop, they're not built by committee, they're built by the artist, right? And I think that's, we can, and again, maybe you think I'm sort of twisting these words, but as I read this story and I encountered these different passages, this was immediately what I was thinking about. They seem to have this symbolic meaning where they were representing the artistic endeavor and the art object, right? So the wallpaper in this weird kind of way becomes an art object, and it's similar to the thing that she's creating in the story that she's writing. Anyway, moving on. 478 also. Behind that outside pattern, the dim shapes get clearer every day. And it's sort of like I was saying earlier, sometimes if you read something the first time it's not quite clear to you, but you read it a second time it gets more clear. And if you read it and reread it, especially with poems, right? Because a lot of times we're befuddled by poems. That'll be our next unit. We can talk about whether we like or dislike poetry. I imagine there'll be a few of us who sort of hate it. But the more you read things, the clearer it can become. So I think that's what it might be a double meaning of what she's getting at in that passage. It is always the same shape, only very numerous. So the actual stories themselves are the same. They don't change. This story has not changed in the 8 or 10 years that I've read it last before prepping for this class. And yet it is somehow different to me than it was then. So the shape is actually the same, but there are very numerous sort of permutations that can happen inside the text that I may or may not be picking up on at a certain time. So again, it's, an art object is not really a living thing, but it can change and it feels different each time we encounter it. And maybe, I don't know how many of you people have made it to museums. We don't, in Sioux City, we're not really close to any. I used to live in Chicago and we'd go to the Art Institute, and you would walk by the big paintings. I remember walking by Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, and you have a different experience. I had a different experience of that painting each time I went up to it. And so the art object is kind of a living thing, and your perception of it can change from time to time. It is always the same shape, only very numerous. So inside the shape, different things can be happening, and I think that's what can happen inside of literature. And how you can take an Intro to Lit course, and someone else might be talking about the yellow wallpaper, and they won't talk about this, but this is something that I see happening in the story. And again, by all means, in the discussion thread, you can tell me whether or not you think this is legitimate or not. 479. There is one marked peculiarity about this paper, a thing nobody seems to notice but myself, and that is that it changes as the light changes. So again, this idea of, the personal connection to the art object, no one else can see it, but it's a thing that changes from each time I see it, okay? So I'm sort of hitting, that's an idea that keeps coming up through these quotations, so I'm not going to hit that over the head too much. But again, it's another instance of how you can interpret a piece. Even though it's the same, you can interpret it differently. Another quote on 480, I have spent hours trying to analyze it. That's what we're doing in this class, right? We're poring over literature, trying to figure it out. So you can do that in the visual arts, you can do that in literary arts. And then 481, this is near the end of the page. There are only 2 more days to get this paper off. And I think that's really interesting. So in one way, she's obviously talking about pulling the actual wallpaper off of the wall, right? Because that's what she does at the end of the story. So they have to leave in 2 days. She has 2 days to literally get this paper off. But what's also been happening while she's been in this house? Well, she's been writing this story. And so in another way, there are only 2 more days left to finish the story that she's been writing on paper this entire time. I mean, we talk about things like, it changes, but no one else sees it change. She has to hide her writing from everyone else, right? The husband thinks that the writing contributes to her sickness. And so the writing is a personal interaction that she has, just like her reaction to the wallpaper is a personal one. And so, this might be another thing, and maybe you don't find this as interesting as I do, but I think that there's sort of a thematic link or symbolic link between the wallpaper, the paper on the wall, and the paper that she's writing her story on. And it seems like in some ways she's imprisoned by the wallpaper, but isn't she also imprisoned by the story? Because the husband thinks that the story is making her sick. And so I think there are all these different kinds of similarities. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. I know this video is a little bit long. We're running at 12 minutes right now. I hope I didn't bore you. And again, we can discuss this in the thread. Maybe you think this is legitimate. Maybe you don't. Maybe there are more quotes that you think support this. If you don't think it's legitimate, give me reasons. Don't say like, "Oh man, you're crazy. You're in your English professor mode." Try to give me a reason argument about why you don't think this applies. But this is sort of what I'm thinking when we're talking about symbols. So this is a long video. It'll be the last one. So I'll leave you to your reading and to the discussion work for this week.